The Pacific Ocean in the late autumn of 1942 was not an ocean of peace. It was a vast, dark arena of industrialized slaughter. For 3 agonizing months, the United States Marines and the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army had been locked in a savage, primeval struggle for a single malaria-ridden strip of land in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. At the absolute center of this meat grinder was an unpaved, mud-slicked airstrip known as Henderson Field to the Americans. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier that kept the Japanese juggernaut at bay. To the Japanese, it was a cancer that had to be cut out at all costs. By November 1942, both empires had reached their breaking point. The campaign had devolved into a brutal war of attrition, draining ships, aircraft, and human lives at a rate never before seen in modern warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy, fiercely proud and masterfully trained in the art of night combat, decided it was time for a final, catastrophic blow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered a massive convoy of 11 large transport ships, packed with over 7,000 elite infantrymen, heavy artillery, and tons of ammunition, to sail from Rabaul. But these slow, vulnerable transports could never survive the daylight attacks of the American Cactus Air Force, operating out of Henderson Field. The solution was simple, violent, and direct. A powerful vanguard of warships would steam into the waters of Iron Biddam Sound under the cover of absolute darkness, systematically obliterate Henderson Field with specialized fragmentation shells, and open the gateway for the transports to land. Commanding this massive bombardment force was Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, flying his flag from the towering pagoda mast of the Imperial battleship Hiei, alongside her sister ship Kirishima. A protective screen of 1 light cruiser and 11 destroyers sliced through the black waves of the new Georgia Sound, a stretch of water the Allies grimly referred to as the Slot. Abe's mission was uncompromising: ruin the runway, burn the American planes, and kill the pilots. But American intelligence had intercepted the whisperings of the Japanese radio nets. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, coordinating the desperate American reinforcement efforts, knew a tidal wave was coming. He rushed his transport ships out of the danger zone and left behind a mismatched defensive force under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan. Callahan's task group 67.4 was structurally flawed, composed of 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. They lacked unified tactical training, and many of the ships had never operated together. Worse still, although some American vessels possessed revolutionary new SG radar systems capable of slicing through the dark, Callahan chose as his flagship the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, which was equipped only with older, inferior radar. As the midnight hour of November 12 ticked over into the early morning of November 13, a pitch-black shroud fell over the Solomon Islands. Heavy rain squalls swept across the water, blotting out the stars and the moon. The 2 fleets were charging blindly toward one another at a combined speed of over 40 knots, heading directly into a tactical geographic funnel bounded by Guadalcanal, Florida Island, and the ominous volcanic silhouette of Savo Island at exactly 1:24. The advanced SG radar of the light cruiser USS Helena picked up the first ghost-like blips of the approaching Japanese fleet at a distance of nearly 30,000 yards. The warning was flashed to Callahan on the San Francisco, but precious, irreplaceable minutes were lost in a chaotic web of radio miscommunications, conflicting steering orders, and shifting tactical formations. The American column began to buckle and weave like a snake trying to turn in a tight corridor. At 1:42, the leading American destroyer, USS Cushing, suddenly loomed out of the blackness, directly ahead of the Japanese destroyer Udachi. The two ships were so close they had to violently throw their rudders over to avoid a literal metal-on-metal collision. The surprise was absolute on both sides. For a few terrifying moments, the two fleets intermingled, passing through each other's lines like phantoms in the dark. The formal battle lines dissolved instantly. The orderly geometry of naval warfare vanished, replaced by an anarchic, point-blank street fight on a pitch-black ocean. The silence of the night was shattered with apocalyptic violence when the Japanese destroyers switched on their massive, blinding searchlights. The high-intensity beams caught the American light cruiser USS Atlanta, pinned against the darkness. Instantly, a hail of high-explosive shells from the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki slammed into the Atlanta, turning her superstructure into a roaring inferno of twisted steel and dying men. But the illumination cut both ways. Pinned in the glare of her own searchlights, the Akatsuki was immediately targeted by the heavy guns of the Atlanta and surrounding American destroyers. Within 90 seconds, the Japanese vessel was torn apart, exploding into a funeral pyre and sinking beneath the waves with almost all hands. The battle became a swirling vortex of fire, smoke, and screaming metal. Ships were firing at targets less than 1,000 yards away, so close that naval artillery could not even be depressed low enough to hit the hulls of adjacent vessels. And anti-aircraft machine guns were used to sweep the decks of enemy warships. The Japanese flagship, the battleship Hiei, steamed directly into the center of the American line, her massive 14-inch guns blasting white-hot fire into the darkness. Out of the smoke charged the tiny American destroyer, USS. In an act of suicidal bravery, the Laffey crossed the bow of the giant battleship, clearing her by a mere 20 feet. As she passed, the Laffey's crew unleashed every weapon they had, 5-inch guns, torpedoes, and machine guns pumping shells directly into the highest bridge structure. The close-range barrage wounded Admiral Abe, killed his chief of staff, and shattered the battleship's superstructure. But the giant could not be stopped by machine guns alone. The Hiei swung her main batteries and fired a devastating salvo that completely obliterated the Laffey, leaving the broken destroyer to sink into the abyss of Iron Bottom Sound. The heavy cruiser, USS San Francisco, found herself trading blows directly with the Hiei. The two ships hammered each other at point-blank range. A devastating salvo from the Hiei struck the San Francisco's bridge, instantly killing Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, Captain Casson Young, and virtually the entire staff. Only a few severely wounded officers survived to keep the shattered cruiser fighting. Amidst this absolute chaos, the fog of war claimed another victim. The burning USS Atlanta, drifting helplessly out of control, drifted directly into the line of fire of the San Francisco. In the blinding smoke, the San Francisco's 8-inch guns accidentally fired into her sister ship, killing Rear Admiral Norman Scott and his staff. In less than 30 minutes, the United States Navy had lost its two top operational commanders in the South Pacific. The water was alive with the deadly wakes of Japanese Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, the stealthy, oxygen-powered killers of the Imperial Navy. The destroyer USS Barton was struck by two of these massive weapons. She broke clean in half and sank in less than 10 seconds, taking her entire crew into the deep. The USS Juno was struck in the engine room by another torpedo, crippling her instantly and forcing her to limp away from the battle line. By 2 o'clock, Admiral Abe, disoriented by his wounds, shocked by the loss of his staff, and completely unaware of how close he was to total victory, lost his nerve. Believing he had encountered a much larger American force than anticipated, and with his flagship High heavily damaged and unable to steer properly, Abe issued the fateful order to retreat. The sun rose on November 13 over a scene of apocalyptic desolation. The calm, tropical waters of the Sound were covered in a thick, choking slick of black fuel oil, dotted with burning wreckage, floating debris, and thousands of sailors desperately trying to stay afloat. The crippled High was stranded near Savo Island, unable to escape the approaching daylight. Throughout the day, wave after wave of Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes from Henderson Field, alongside B-17 bombers from Espirito Santo, swarmed the wounded Japanese giant. By nightfall, the High was a burnt-out sinking shell, and her crew was forced to scuttle her. She became the first Japanese battleship lost in the entire war, but the American victory was paid for in rivers of blood. As the surviving American ships limped back toward the safety of Espiritu Santo, the damaged light cruiser USS Juno was suddenly struck by a torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-26. The torpedo hit the ship's ammunition magazines, triggering a catastrophic, blinding explosion that vaporized the cruiser in a single second. Among the hundreds of sailors lost in that instant were the 5 Sullivan brothers, a tragedy that devastated the home front and forever etched the brutality of Guadalcanal into the American national consciousness. Due to communication failures and fear of further submarine attacks, the remaining U.S. ships did not stop to look for survivors. For 8 agonizing days, nearly 100 men who survived the initial blast drifted in shark-infested waters on primitive rafts. By the time rescue arrived, only 10 men remained alive. The first phase of the battle was over, but the war of attrition was far from finished. Though the first night of surface combat had ended in a tactical draw and a horrific loss of American lives, it achieved a monumental strategic success. Henderson Field had been spared from destruction. Admiral Abe's failure to execute his primary bombardment mission meant that the Cactus Air Force was still fully operational, its planes fueled and ready to hunt. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, furious at the retreat of his battleships, immediately relieved Abe of command and restructured his strategy. The Japanese could not afford to hesitate. Their ground forces on Guadalcanal were literally starving, reduced to eating roots and leaves while facing relentless American pressure. Yamamoto ordered Vice Admiral Nobu Take Kondo to assemble a new force centered around the remaining battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their directive was identical to the first: smash Henderson Field, crush the American air power, and force the convoy of transports through to the beaches. On the morning of November 14, The 11 Japanese troop transports, escorted by a destroyer screen under Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, were ordered to make their final run down the slot. Tanaka, a master of amphibious warfare, knew it was a dangerous gamble to move during daylight hours without total air superiority, but Imperial orders left him no choice. The moment the transports came within range, the Hornet's nest at Henderson Field emptied. SBD Dauntless dive bombers tore through the morning sky, joined by aircraft from the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, which was operating just south of the Solomons. The sky above the slot became a swirling canvas of anti-aircraft fire and descending bombs. The American pilots pressed home their attacks with relentless fury. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa was caught in the open, struck repeatedly by bombs and torpedoes until she rolled over and capsized. Then the bombers turned their attention to the helpless troop transports. One by one, the large ships were ripped open by heavy bombs. Tremendous secondary explosions rocked the convoy as ammunition holds detonated. 6 of the precious transports were blasted apart and sent to the bottom of the ocean. 2 more were heavily damaged but remained afloat, leaving Tanaka with only a fraction of his original force. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned or were left drifting in the water, their equipment lost forever. Yet, showing the unyielding determination that characterized the imperial military, Tanaka gathered the remaining 4 transports and pressed onward through the smoke, determined to beach the ships on Guadalcanal under the cover of the next night, realizing that the local American cruiser forces had been completely shattered and spent. During the bloody battle on November 13, Admiral William Bull Halsey, the overall commander of the South Pacific area, knew he had to play his absolute last card. He broke apart the protective screen of the carrier Enterprise and formed Task Force 64, placing it under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee. Lee was an unconventional naval officer. He was a soft-spoken, analytical man, an expert marksman who had won 7 Olympic medals in shooting, and most importantly, a brilliant pioneer in the use of naval radar. He understood the strengths and limitations of the technology better than any man alive. Halsey handed Lee a powerful but completely uncoordinated force. The modern, state-of-the-art fast battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota, escorted by a scratch group of 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. None of these destroyers had ever operated with the battleships before, and the crews had no time to train as a cohesive unit. As Task Force 64 entered the waters of Iron Bottom Sound on the evening of November 14, Lee knew he was risking the last line of defense. If his battleships were lost, the United States Navy would lose control of the South Pacific. Admiral Kondo's bombardment fleet approached Savo Island shortly before midnight, splitting his force into several independent groups to trap and destroy any American defenders. At 23 o'clock, the silent darkness of the Sound was punctured by the hum of electronics. Sitting inside the plot room of the USS Washington, Admiral Lee watched the glowing green screens of his superior SG radar. He had a perfect digital picture of the Japanese movements well before his lookouts could see them with their eyes. At 23:17, the Washington's massive 16-inch main batteries swung toward the Japanese light cruiser Shiyanami at a range of 18,000 yards. The night split open with a terrifying, artificial lightning flash as the Washington unleashed a thunderous 9-gun salvo. The South Dakota followed suit. The Japanese ships, relying primarily on visual optics and night binoculars, were caught completely off guard by heavy shells raining down from the darkness. However, the Japanese destroyers responded with terrifying speed and precision. Slicing through the black water, they launched a massive spread of over 30 long lance torpedoes toward the advanced American destroyer screen. The results were immediate and devastating. The USS Preston was struck by a barrage of shells and turned into a burning wreck within minutes. The USS Walk was hit by a torpedo that blew off her bow, causing her to sink rapidly. The USS Benham had her bow shattered by another torpedo blast, removing her from the fight. The USS Gwin was heavily damaged by shellfire and forced to withdraw. Within 15 minutes of the opening shots, Lee's entire destroyer screen had been completely wiped out or neutralized. The 2 American battleships were now exposed, left entirely alone without a protective ring against submarines and torpedo boats, compounding the crisis. A severe mechanical failure struck the USS South Dakota. An engineer on board accidentally threw a circuit breaker, causing a massive electrical failure that knocked out the ship's radars, fire control systems, and internal communications. Blinded and linguistically isolated, the South Dakota inadvertently steered too close to the Japanese lines. Suddenly, the Japanese heavy cruisers switched on their slits, catching the massive American battleship completely illuminated in the dark. Kondo's entire fleet concentrated their fire on the giant target. Over the next 20 minutes, the South Dakota was struck by more than 26 major shells. Her superstructure was riddled with holes, her radio antennas were shot away, and fires raged across her decks. Though her thick armor prevented her vital engineering spaces from being breached, she was entirely knocked out of the action as an effective fighting unit and began to pull away. With the South Dakota retreating and the destroyers gone, the USS Washington was left completely alone against the entire remaining Japanese fleet. Admiral Kondo believed he had won the battle and ordered his flagship, the battleship Kirishima, to close in for the kill on the burning South Dakota. In doing so, Kondo made a fatal tactical error. He completely lost track of the Washington. Admiral Lee, coolly analyzing the radar data from his bridge, tracked the Kirishima as she turned. The Washington crept through the shadow of the burning American destroyers, using the smoke to mask her approach. At exactly midnight, at a point-blank range of only 8,400 yards, virtually spitting distance for capital ships, the Washington opened fire with her main 16-inch batteries. It was a masterclass in radar-directed gunnery. Over the course of 7 minutes, the Washington fired 75 massive 16-inch shells and over 105-inch shells at the Kirishima. The impact was cataclysmic. At least 9 16-inch structural shells hit the Japanese battleship, tearing through her armor like paper, destroying her steering gear, smashing her engines, and setting her interior completely ablaze. The Kirishima was transformed into a floating volcano, spinning helplessly out of control, realizing his flagship was doomed, and his fleet was being systematically picked apart by an invisible American giant. Admiral Kondo ordered a full retreat. The remaining Japanese warships turned and fled back up the slot. The USS Washington, unscathed and masterfully handled by Lee, pursued them just long enough to ensure they were truly retreating before turning back to protect the battered South Dakota. The final phase of the battle reached its grim conclusion. The crippled Kirishima capsized and rolled into the depths of the Sound. Nearby, the 4 remaining Japanese troop transports under Admiral Tanaka had deliberately run themselves aground on the beaches of Guadalcanal at Tassafaranga, desperately trying to unload their cargo. But without warship protection, they were completely defenseless. The Cactus Air Force from Henderson Field, alongside American field artillery on the island, and the destroyer USS Meade, spent the entire morning systematically bombarding the beached transports. The ships were completely destroyed, and the vast majority of their vital supplies, heavy artillery, and provisions were burned on the beach. Of the 7,000 reinforcement troops who set out from Rabaul, only about 2,000 made it ashore, starving, shell-shocked, and completely stripped of the heavy equipment needed to launch an offensive. The naval battle of Guadalcanal was over. It was one of the bloodiest, most chaotic, and most intensely fought naval engagements in human history. The United States Navy had paid a horrifying price to admirals dead, 7 destroyers sunk, and 2 light cruisers destroyed, along with hundreds of brave sailors lost to the deep. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and an entire fleet of critical transport ships. But the true significance of the battle lay in its strategic outcome. This was the absolute turning point of the Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese military never again possessed the resources, the shipping, or the operational strength to launch a major offensive to retake Guadalcanal. The war of attrition had broken the back of the Imperial Navy's elite surface forces. From this moment on, the Japanese Empire was forced onto a permanent, bloody defensive, while the United States began its relentless, unstoppable march across the Pacific toward the home islands. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound had become a graveyard of steel, but they had secured the gateway to ultimate victory.